We'll now look at the different brush types, their tensile strength, a few different market grades, and their general use. The first on our list is the flat, not to be mistaken for the bright, this half length on the left. The first grade of flat we'll examine is the bristle, the workhorse of the various hairs we have available. Rigid, stiffer than the other fiber types, and can carry a lot of paint on them, and push it around without collapsing. You can see here it bounces back pretty quick. It has a pretty good springiness to it. It delivers a pretty decent amount of paint and gradates over a good distance or length of brushstroke. Because it's wiry, the hairs won't stay compacted together for very long, which results in the raspy, dry brushstrokes. Something to take note of for many different effects. On its edge, it produces a clean, relatively sharp linear stroke. Rotational strokes are great, with the range of width that changes from side to front. Stamping is really nice. The bristles do a great job of displacing the pigment on a per-strand basis, or really small bits displaced like stippling. It makes great calligraphic marks, and almost parallel to the surface, these brushstrokes we lay over each other do minor disruption to the color layers below, and leave a healthy abundance of paint on the top stroke that we can then work with. Next is the mongoose hair, or what should be semi-rigid. But all the mongoose hair brushes I've been purchasing lately collapse upon the brush handle's weight. I'm not really sure what that's all about. What's fantastic about these brushes, they push the paint without displacing too much of the previous layers, where the bristles mix everything as the paint is pressed to the surface. They're awesome for dry brushing and for broken edges, or what are called deckled edges of the brush strokes, that little raspy broken end. With a little modification of the brush hairs by displacing them with your fingers, these brush strokes make fantastic foliage marks and great wispy lines. As well, when placing color over color, or covering a previous layer, the mongoose hair adds paint without much of any mixing at all, neatly stacking in their brushstroke shape. So it sort of like preserves the shape as you place it. These are great brushes, but if we're not aware of the brush hair types, then what we mostly ever pick up are bristles and synthetics. This last brush type is becoming more and more of what we see on the shelves, as some of the traditional materials are being replaced with a cheaper, more accessible material like these synthetics. Unlike any previous brushes, these have a snapback spring to them, and for as soft as they're supposed to be, they're not really all that soft compared to real sables. They hold their shape and spread very little when pressed. They do take some getting used to, especially if you come from using natural fiber brushes. They are sharp and clean in their stroke shape. They hold a lot of paint and spread it far. They are very vacuum tight, so they don't break up into little striations as easily as the other brush hair types do. They dry brush well, and they are sharp in shape, so they're great for pattern or zigzag cuts in the strokes. They're nice and sharp for straight edges, and have a rigid toe so they put down a good amount of paint on the skinny edge, and they don't run out of paint as quickly as the other brush hair types. And as for coverage, it's amazing how well it can cover without mixing, but at the right angle and degree of pressure can mix beautifully. So it's sort of like a dual brush in that way. This first mixing demo is with the synthetic brush. The paint is easy to short side displace, using the toe of the brush for cutting the feathered strokes to shift the paint along the terminator. But rotating the brush to the broadside is a totally different story. Brush is just soft enough that the hairs don't really pick up the paint that easily and move it. So you find yourself flopping the brush around a lot more and having to go over and over and over the same area to push or displace the paint. No paint is being lifted, so it's not actually turning the area into an ugly mess, but it's just not moving the paint as easily as, say, a bristle brush will, and so as a result it feels a little bit more of a struggle. The next brush is the bristle, and as you can see, this brush is quick to mix the paint. It's thick enough with hairs and With the bristles being so heavy and so coarse, it's like painting with a broom. Everything is swept up into the current, and keeping the paints from overmixing is not an easy task. We end up layering more paint than is necessary to recover a lot of the overmixed paints. But this brush is excellent for fast and immediate mixing. Just be careful because you can overdo it with a bristle very quickly. This last edge is mixed with the Mongoose hairbrush. This is my favorite brush to soften forms with, as it striates the paints rather than immediately gradates them into a softness like the bristle does. And because of its floppy nature, the softening of an edge feels more organic and painterly in the end. What's also nice about this brush is that it's very good at keeping the paint clean. Notice how white the titanium remains with the other two brush hair types, the white was polluted rather quickly. I start this sphere with the bristle and finish with the sable. The bristle is great for massing, as this shows. I'm creating actual facets for the larger changes in value along the terminator to expand the gradient throughout the form. Whenever there is a long drawn-out curve, it's best to tile the values rather than trying to get the paint to blend on the surface or to mix on the surface that far out. The bristle is really good for doing this kind of mixing, but is also really taking away from the light side and dropping the value pretty quickly, which is good for turning the form, but won't be when I need to hold on to the light. Switching over to the sable helps soften the paint without major displacement. Using the bristle, I find I have to stack more layers of paint to rebuild the lighter parts of the forms, as the bristle smashes everything together, leaving no pigments untouched and unaltered. The synthetic handles the more subtle gradations with much more sensitivity to the changes in the values. The bristle is too abrupt. The sable is also great for introducing the reflective lights into the darker side of the ball. There's so much pigment already sitting on the canvas that whatever I add will never be enough to compete with the previous layer. And the brush is just soft enough that it does a really good job of moderately changing the gradation over time. As you can also see, it's a little bit easier to mix the paint by stamping it instead of brush stroking it. By brush stroking it, you're moving it to a different location. By stamping it, you're actually just pressing the paint together to get it to mix with more efficiency. The cylinder is rendered using only the Mongoose hairbrush. This form I made a little bit larger than it should have been for this demonstration, and as a result takes a little bit longer to render up, which is why it's one of the longer demos on here. I'm adding paint as I turn the form, darkening the facets in the light to help it turn quicker in time. It requires layering of the paint, or else I need to find a way to drag the shadow value out farther to subtly change the form in the light, which is really, really hard to do without messing up that edge that separates the light from the shadow. This demo is 3 minutes in length here on the video, but it took about 10 minutes to entirely gradate. There are no better or worse brushes to use between these grades of hairs, only efficiency of time and or visual preference to how the colors gradate together. A key to all of this is to practice a lot, experiment a lot, and forget the need to produce results that will impress or sell. Learning is in its own lane, and leading your learning with vanity or financial needs will get in the way and just completely disconnect you from your learning. It looks like a lot of stamping with the brush, but really each is a small brush stroke pulled in a direction to get the paint to rake across the rest of the paint on the surface. Because the brush has a thin ferrule of hairs, there isn't a lot of fiber strength, which is why I'm having to feather so much. The results are pleasing, but they do take a lot of time to complete. These are all done with a bristle, a nice strong end to work with. Flats are also technically unique in the brush types, as they are really good at generating corners, whether drawn as a line or pulled as a shape. Corners are very fast and simple with this brush type. Drawing straight lines using the toe edge is really easy to do, almost easier to control than drawing one with a round. Depending upon how and where you hold the brush handle, you can get very mechanical straight lines or more organic ones. Drawing straight lines by pulling them all at once is nice to do with this brush, but also sculpting them little bit by little bit is also very rewarding and creates the illusion of small facets rather than it just being a line. Calligraphic mark making is really fun with these brushes. Because of such a scale change between the narrow side and the broad, the marks can be very interesting. You can also facet together circles if you don't trust pulling them all at once. Little tiny chunks. It's basically like doing an extreme 8-sided or 12-sided or 16-sided shape, but letting each brushstroke sort of overlap to create the illusion of the circle. Or you can use massing and spin a circle into existence, twirling the brush. There are many more mark types to be found with this brush. Go get curious and find them for yourself.